Excellencies, Ministers, Ambassadors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. It is a great pleasure to be here addressing such a distinguished audience today, and I'd like to express my special thanks to Mr. Eren, Director of, and his team of the TRT for the kind invitation and this excellent organization. Today, I will be sharing some of my views on NATO's role in the face of the new security environment. NATO has been the cornerstone of transatlantic security since the end of the World War II. It has been a central consultation forum among allies in ensuring peace and prosperity throughout Europe for decades. The commitment of allies to the collective defense pledge and to cooperative security has provided a robust deterrence against potential aggression. However, while the risk of state-on-state conventional warfare has receded, NATO is currently being challenged by new and increasingly hybrid threats. The new global strategic environment presents challenges to the traditional rules-based security order in and beyond the Euro-Atlantic area. Rapid advances in technology is one of the major, perhaps the prime causes of the challenge against the established security order. While we all undoubtedly benefit from technological progress, we cannot ignore the potential adverse effects it contains. Some of these have changed the character of the armed conflict, as you notice. War was primarily a state activity in the past. Now, with more state-like actors and proxies, the distinction is becoming blurred. Hybrid and cyber warfare are significant challenges to military leaders who are trained to fight in the old-school military domains of land, sea, or air. The methods of hybrid warfare are rapidly evolving with the help of technology. Transnational terrorism is also on the rise. Radical, violent groups are inflicting damage not only on their own countries, but also in faraway lands. No country, entity, or individual can be fully immune to the reach of terrorism. Terrorists use social media to recruit vulnerable individuals, spread their ideology, and also even share real-time footage of their horrible acts to induce a shock effect for propaganda purposes. Unfortunately, governments or social media companies are not yet fully and properly equipped to counter such actions. Another area of competition is underway in the domain of information technologies. Nowadays, every little gadget in our pocket is producing and collecting massive amounts of data. The availability of data and the computing power to analyze it forced decision makers to review traditional norms and structure. Here the quantum age of computing is coming into play as both a possible risk and an enormous opportunity. We also need to focus on other emerging and disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and autonomous systems. One game-changer example is unmanned aerial vehicles, which are being used extensively for reconnaissance purposes as well as airstrikes. Turkey is one of the few countries operating indigenously developed UAVs. However, technology is the proverbial double-edged sword. High-tech and off-the-shelf devices can also have devastating effects in the hands of terrorists. For example, Daesh used commercially available drones both for surveillance and attacking soft targets, first in Syria and later in Mosul. The PKK also has been using drones in attacks against Turkey. Similarly, the recent swarm drone attack on the Aramco oil field in Saudi Arabia showed us that further measures have to be developed and implemented to bolster the security and resilience of critical infrastructure and strategic assets. In light of the challenges to the security environment, NATO is under pressure to adapt rapidly. Contrary to the traditional understanding that a military alliance requires a common enemy, NATO has continued to adapt and grow in the face of diffuse and emerging threats. The alliance is still the bastion of the transatlantic security architecture and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. As part of this adaptation, NATO needs a unified vision for the future instead of a unified perception of a common enemy. This vision should focus on collective benefits rather than relative gains of each member nation. Furthermore, unlike the possible risks of security in some other parts of Europe, threats against Turkey are not just a theoretical possibility, they are real, direct, and substantial. They are unfortunately happening right now. Therefore, we believe both planning and execution should be better coordinated within NATO to counter all threats in a consistent manner. NATO today is present in Kosovo while also conducting its biggest operation in Afghanistan and provides support and training to the Iraqi armed forces. NATO's previous shift towards out-of-area operations showed its institutional capability to transform itself. In this regard, NATO retains considerable advantages due to the technological superiority and the military effectiveness of its members. Both the nuclear and the conventional deterrence provided by NATO against potential aggressors is indispensable in maintaining credibility and stability. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our contribution to the overall security and stability of Europe in general and NATO in particular is perhaps of higher significance today than ever. With a strong military capability, well-established host nation support facilities, and a unique geography which enables force projection to many conflict-ridden locations, Turkey is one of the most prominent members of NATO. In terms of burden sharing, Turkey is strictly committed to the NATO Defense Investment Pledge. We aim to reach the 2% target by 2024. In 2019, Turkey increased its defense spending in real terms. This rise includes a significant growth in the defense budget. Turkey has already been well above the 20% threshold of the spending on major equipment systems, and this ratio is expected to surpass 38% by the end of this fiscal year. Turkey's national operations and contributions to NATO forces in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, in addition to enhancing security and stability, also help to prevent illegal crossings in the Aegean Sea. In particular, we provide the majority of the tactical picture of the Black Sea, and we are among the top 3 allied contributors to NATO standing naval forces. We also host radar sites for NATO's ballistic missile defense architecture. Additionally, we will assume the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force role of NATO response force in 2021. Turkey is one of the 4 framework nations of the Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan and has been operating the Hamid Karzai International Airport since 2015. On the other hand, the Turkish Navy has been conducting Operation Mediterranean Shield since 2006 in order to sustain and protect maritime security in the Eastern Mediterranean. This operation also complements NATO's Operation Sea Guardian, to which Turkey is the biggest contributor. However, the emerging strategic landscape in the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming more and more complicated. The discovery of hydrocarbon resources has aroused the close interest of both regional and international actors. Turkey will protect its own lawful rights and interests within its continental shelf, as well as protecting the rights of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as one of the guarantor countries. In short, Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus cannot be excluded from the energy equation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Overall, with around 1,300 personnel deployed in operations, missions, and headquarters, Turkey is among the top 3 biggest troop-contributing nations. I believe all these assets and capabilities make it clear in today's complex security environment, Turkey's strategic role for NATO is vital and permanent. In my view, NATO's center of gravity is its unity, solidarity, and cohesion. From this perspective, Turkey is at the center of the alliance. I would like to add that arguments made about Turkey's supposed change of axis or strategic orientation are completely misguided. Distinguished guests, an important issue I would like to turn to is NATO-EU cooperation. Turkey is actively contributing to all efforts to address the multiple challenges that affect Europe. We fully support European Union's defense initiatives. However, EU's efforts must be aligned with NATO. Most importantly, the non-EU members of NATO should be transparently involved and informed about EU activities in accordance with the Berlin Plus agreement between the 2 organizations. Distinguished guests, among the allies, Turkey has unfortunately long suffered the most from terrorism and has long been fighting against it in all of its forms and manifestations. In this context, we have been warning all our friends against the dangerous consequences of arming and politically supporting the PKK-affiliated YPG terrorist organization in Syria. When some allies started to supply the YPG, which is one and the same as the PKK against Daesh in Syria, we warned against the risks of trying to defeat one terrorist threat by employing another. The PKK is widely recognized as a terrorist group, but it took for too long for this fact to sink in among our allies. Now, the same dilemma applies to the classification of the YPG as a terrorist group. In the meantime, regrettably and deplorably, YPG received substantial material support from our allies. Each weapon handed over to YPG ended up in the hands of the PKK, ready to be turned on us, a fellow NATO member. With all those support YPG got from our allies, they increased atrocities against the local population of the region, including the forced migration, confiscation of land, and conscription of people, even children, against their will. Those actions led to a change in the demography of the region and mass migration to Turkey. Of the 4 million refugees in Turkey, about 500,000, or 600,000, are Kurds who have fled the atrocities of YPG. Turkey's long and patient discussions with the US on the establishment of a safe zone in the area to address its legitimate security concerns remained inconclusive. Finally, we were compelled to act in order to eliminate the threat posed by the PKK or YPG. Operation Peace Spring was launched in the east of the Euphrates in Syria on October 9, as you all know. Our only goals are to protect our borders, prevent a terror corridor in the north of Syria, put an end to the presence of the Daesh, PKK, YPG, and all other terrorists in the north of Syria, and finally, to establish a safe zone so as to enable almost 2 million displaced Syrians, including Arabs, Kurds, Christians, Yazidis, Kaldanis, to voluntarily and peacefully return to their lands and homes. From the very beginning, preserving the political unity and the territorial integrity of Syria has been a priority. From the very start, we have also affirmed our commitment to protect civilians and all religious and ethnic groups in that region. As long as the PKK-YPG is active in Syria, neither country nor the region can reach permanent peace and security and stability. Let me be clear, the PKK-YPG can in no way represent our Kurdish and Syrian brothers and sisters and friends, just as Daesh does not and cannot represent Muslims. In the last few days, 20 civilians, including a 9-month-old baby, have been tragically killed and 181 civilians wounded in cross-border and indiscriminate PKK-YPG mortar fire into residential areas in Turkey. Over 1,000 mortar shells have landed in Turkish territory. I believe these attacks clearly show the true nature of this terrorist organization. 3 days ago, Turkey and US reached an agreement to pause Operation Peace Spring for 120 hours starting on 17 October. The pause is based on the following conditions. YPG, PKK, whatever it is, will withdraw from the safe zone, which will be around 30 kilometers in that, stretching from the east of the Euphrates to the Iraqi border. YPG, PKK, heavy weapon will be recollected. YPG, PKK, fortifications and all other fighting positions will be demolished. However, implementation of the agreement is critical, and we are watching closely to make sure all of the conditions are met. If the withdrawal is completed on time, the operation will be halted. Let me underline that we are in complete agreement with the US on the need to defeat Daesh. In the last couple of days, around 200 Daesh militants and their family members have been taken into custody or surrendered. Moreover, we have already eliminated more than 3,000 Daesh in Operation Euphrates Shield, you will remember. I must underline one more time that Turkish armed forces is the only coalition army that has fought hand-to-hand against Daesh, and we will continue to neutralize them whenever and wherever we see. In this effort, what brought us together with the US was our bond as fellow members of NATO. I believe this operation and all our other efforts will help to promote the vision of President Erdogan for peace and security in the area. That's all what I have. Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience, for your attention. Thank you.
General Hulusi Akar, I thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the panel part of this discussion. And since we have been running late, I'd like to do this as quickly as possible. So, to my left, I'm going to invite first up Tarcan Ildem, the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at NATO. And next to him will be Jan Vincent Rostowski, the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Minister of Finance of Poland. And next to him, we'll have Yavuz Selim Karan, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Turkey. I don't have to twist my neck anymore. I'm grateful. And I'm really happy to invite Alexei Pushkov, the Chairman of the Commission of Information and Media of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. And finally, Luke Coffey, the Director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Luke. So I see they've set a timer for us at the back over there. Someone's in the way of it, but I know that we've got until 3 o'clock. So I want to go as quickly as possible into the discussion. We've heard from the Defense Minister, and NATO is a third rail topic. It's a hot potato topic, which makes it all the more interesting for us here. I'm going to do my best to stay out of the way and to ensure you all interact with each other as much as possible. But I do think that given the speech from Turkey's Defense Minister at an interesting time, because he's mentioned Operation Peace Spring across the border in northern Syria, it's a good opportunity for us to open up the discussion by looking at NATO in that context. So, Tarcan Ildem, let me start with you. And we look at Turkey conducting an operation where it says this is a terrorist organization that we've been trying to get rid of for a long, long time. A fellow NATO ally has been arming this group. And now when we finally say we're sick and tired, we're fed up, we're sorting this out, we have another NATO ally, such as Emmanuel Macron, saying this is insanity. We have a big chunk of the NATO members treating it as if Turkey is conducting an invasion of a sovereign country. What is going on? What does that say about NATO?
Well, first of all, it is such a pleasure and privilege to be in my native country representing NATO at this critical time. First of all, I have to say that the ongoing Peace Spring operation is being discussed and consulted at NATO. NATO, as the minister rightly mentioned, is a forum of political consultation among allies, and there has already been a number of occasions for NATO ambassadors at council meeting to have ample opportunity to receive a briefing from the Turkish side, but also on Friday there was a meeting of the council, and Secretary Pompeo briefed ambassadors about the joint statement reached between two important allies, Turkey and the United States. First of all, I have to emphasize that for the 70 years that NATO existed, and we are celebrating the 70th anniversary this year, there have been a number of occasions where allies had difficult discussions. We can remember Suez Canal crisis in 1956, when France left the integrated military structure in 1967. Also, during the Gulf War, there were some discussions in 2003 on Iraq. So what I'm trying to say is that in a alliance where we have democratic countries, there may be differences of opinion. But the strength of NATO is to use all the existing mechanisms for these differences be ironed out. And in each stress test, I have to emphasize that NATO came out with a strong sense of unity and cohesion. And I'm sure that we will prevail with this unity and cohesion in the run up to the leaders' meeting to bring heads of state and government together on 4th of December in London. Yes, the operation provides a very good window of opportunity for things to calm down in northern Syria. NATO is recognizing the legitimate security concerns of Turkey. In fact, as Secretary General Stoltenberg has emphasized during his recent visit to Istanbul, when he met President Erdogan and Ministers Çavuşoğlu and Akar, he told that Turkey is in the front line of a volatile region facing many security challenges, and at the same time NATO allies recognize the security concerns. Therefore, we are watching carefully in Brussels all these developments, and we hope that this window of opportunity provided with the joint statement agreed upon by two important allies could pave the way for the necessary calm to respond to the security concerns of Turkey, a very valued and important ally within the alliance.
Okay, and just for absolute clarity, if anybody else on the panel wants to jump in, just let me know. But for the sake of keeping this moving on for the time being, Jan Vincent Rostovsky, it's a stress test, no more, no less. We've had this in the past with the Suez crisis, and we'll have it again. This isn't a divorce, it's just a couple arguing. Do you accept that?
Well, I certainly...
You've got to press that button.
Excuse me, the technology. I certainly can't imagine, or can't certainly hope it won't be a divorce. Nevertheless, I have to say quite clearly that I came to this Congress on the understanding that it was going to be an academic and analytical congress. And it's quite obvious that it is actually a political event focused on the military operation in Syria. So I have a very brief statement to make. I think it is vital that the military operation not resume, and it is vital that the ceasefire be made permanent. I'm willing, of course, to talk about other issues about facing NATO. I think that there are major problems, and I shall be happy to discuss the questions that you sent to us.
Okay.
As far as Syria is concerned, that's all I want to say, but it is clear that these things are essential. NATO is about defense and peace, and it needs to stay that way.
Okay, so if you'd allow me to then ask you, President Erdogan has signaled that he'd like to invoke Article 5 if possible, if he doesn't feel as if the allies are supporting him enough. Do you believe it meets the standard if Turkey faces a security threat on the border, it invokes Article 5, one for all for one, collective security? Do you believe that it applies?
Unfortunately, my friend, it hasn't applied since today. That's why we started this operation in northeastern Syria. We started this operation before in the western part of Euphrates before. Now the threat emanating from the east side of Euphrates has going on. We try to solve it with our allies in NATO. Yes, as our Minister of Defense underlined that unified action is very vital for NATO and NATO allies. We saw this solidarity from NATO administration, especially from the Secretary General, but we couldn't see this solidarity from the allies in NATO. That's why we started this operation, and we continue this operation because it is an existential threat to Turkey. If there is an existential threat to one NATO country, it is an existential threat to all NATO and NATO allies. That is written in the NATO treaty, so that's why this operation is emanating from our lawful rights, and we are holding it according to the UN Charter 51, and nobody can discuss the legitimacy of this operation. Well, we do not prefer start this operation. We tried a lot to solve this issue with our ally United States before. All you can remember the Membish roadmap. We discussed it with the US, and we agreed on some specific plan. We agreed on to pull out all the terrorist base in Manbij in 90 days, but it is 16 months that the terrorists are still there, so it didn't work. And after that, we again start to work with our ally United States for creating a safe zone in northeastern side of Syria, but it still didn't work. That's why we have to start this operation in order to eliminate all the terrorist group there. So we couldn't see, we see this solidarity from NATO administration, but we couldn't see this solidarity from our allies in NATO.
Okay, so, and I'm going to come back to you, Jan Vincent Rostovsky, to ask you if you accept the Turkish argument under the umbrella of the NATO alliance.
I have said what I intend to say on this subject. The military operation absolutely should not resume, and the ceasefire should be made permanent. Thank you.
Okay. Yavuz Selim Kiran.
I would like to correct the term ceasefire, my friend, here, because it is not a ceasefire now. We agree with the United States. This is just agreement with our legitimate ally. We cannot sit together with the terrorist organization, so it is not a ceasefire.
Okay. Luke Coffey, is Turkey right? Were the Americans asleep at the wheel in thinking that they could, in order to fight Daesh, arm a group that would possibly be existentially dangerous to a NATO ally? Whether it was under the Obama administration or the continuation through the Trump administration. Is the Turkish aggravation, annoyance at its American ally justified?
Well, certainly there was a tendency by the Obama administration to, on these big issues in the Middle East, especially as it pertained to Syria, to act in a very knee-jerk manner. I think President Obama found himself in a very difficult position politically when ISIS was starting to cut people's heads off live on the internet, and he had no plan to deal with this. So he rushed into it. He decided that we're going to arm the YPG. His administration made promises to Turkey that were simply impossible to keep. For example, the YPG will stay east of the Euphrates River. Impossible to enforce that. Or at the end of the fighting, we will recollect all the weapons. Well, anyone who's ever been to a combat zone knows that that's an impossible promise to make, so we should have never made that. And then, of course, President Trump, in his particular fashion on the campaign trail, made defeating ISIS a main part of his election strategy. And frankly, I don't think he really cared how it was done, as long as it was, finished. So now we are all collecting the pieces, trying to pick up the pieces of this broken policy, and we have run the serious risk of alienating or at least being seen to undermining one of the most important actors in NATO, and that's Turkey. But in terms of the broader question you posed about Article 5 and terrorism and should Turkey invoke Article 5, this is debated often whenever there's a large terrorist attack somewhere inside the alliance. And firstly, we should recognize that Article 5 isn't a trigger. It's not that a country can just one day wake up and say, I want to invoke Article 5, and the other members of NATO are at war. This has to be done with a consensus among all members of NATO. So that's one part. The second part, I think that it'd be a very slippery slope to start using Article 5 for terrorist attacks because, as we've learned from the experience after 9/11, NATO isn't exactly equipped with all the tools to deal with terrorism. NATO is one tool inside a larger toolbox to confront terrorism, but it doesn't have the competency over terrorist finance or border security or law enforcement or these sort of things.
So let's ask Yavuz Selim Kiran and Alexei Pushkov. I'm going to come to you in a moment, so my apologies for not getting to you yet, but let's ask Yavuz Selim Kiran. The point is, you can't just invoke Article 5 because even in this instance, what country per se are you fighting? Is it clearly defined? And we saw after 9/11 as well, what is a war on terror? Can you actually fight terror? It's fluid. Is it Afghanistan as a nation state? Is it Iraq as a nation state? And so on and so forth. Is there a good point made there that in trying to get everybody on board when it's a specific terrorist organization attacking a specific state, and that specific organization goes beyond boundaries and borders, it's going to put everybody in a big mess?
My friend, do you know that there have been more than 300 attacks emanating from the Syrian soils to Turkey? And even nowadays, there have been around 1,000 harassment attacks during the operation there. So why can't we work the Article 5? If we can't, then let's look at the 51st article of the UN Charter. So it is truly legitimate and fully legitimate operation. So you should underline that there have been ongoing attacks from the Syrian soils to Turkish soils. So that's why we can work the...
Luke, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly clarify that after 9/11, when Article 5 was invoked, it was to provide very specific capabilities that the U.S. needed at the time. There were only two Article 5 NATO operations. One was Operation Eagle Assist, which saw European air surveillance aircraft come over to North America for the first time and help America patrol its skies. And the other one was Operation Active Endeavor, which was a maritime security operation in the Eastern Mediterranean linked to terrorism. Even the mission in Afghanistan was not an Article 5 mission. It was a NATO-led mission, but not an Article 5 mission. I think that's an important distinction. So if Turkey has certain capability gaps that it feels like its NATO allies can provide, then that's a very serious discussion.
But it's not everybody else just joining a military operation, right? It needs to be specific.
Yeah, it could be a military capability, but
Right.
I think we need to have a discussion about specific capabilities as opposed to about like grand ideas
Right.
about invoking Article 5.
Okay. I want to bring in Alexei Pushkov. Big picture question. When everybody talks about NATO and the alliance and so on, do you feel like the boogeyman as the Russian in the room?
Not at all. I think the whole debate is not about Russia today, first. Second, Russia, and probably some will disagree on this panel, is not really a security problem for any NATO member. Of course, we hear different voices from some neighboring countries, but Russia does not have any conflict with any NATO or EU member. We have a conflict in Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, not a EU member. It's a complicated conflict. It's, I would say, the remnants of the fall of the Soviet Union. But with NATO, Russia does not feel that we antagonize NATO to the extent that NATO antagonizes itself towards us. What we see from NATO is a constant, I would say, blow up of the so-called Russian threat. I think that maybe some people at NATO just jumped on this Ukrainian crisis as an occasion to boost NATO capacities. That's possible. NATO was losing, to a certain extent, a sense of purpose. It was losing the war in Afghanistan, and it will lose the war in Afghanistan in, I think, in about 1 year. NATO did not play any significant role in a number of very acute crises, like it did not prevent the United States from going to Iraq. So when key members of NATO, like US and Great Britain, go into an aggressive war against Iraq, NATO keeps silent. There are some members of NATO who disagreed, like France and Germany, but others, they just pass this under silence. So, is NATO about defense, or is NATO about supporting the United States, or is NATO about passing under silence whatever the United States do? It's a question for a big debate.
Right. But if you'd allow me, right, we have, say, the Swedes saying we're considering joining NATO, and immediately, whoosh, the Russian nuclear bombers go and fly nearby and say, hello, we're here.
Look, no.
What does that mean? It shows that Russia takes NATO seriously enough, doesn't it?
Look, you just missed about 18 years. Say, in those 18 years, there was a big development. The talk about Russia possibly joining NATO was in 1999-2000. It was specifically discussed between Tony Blair and Vladimir Putin in April 2000. And I don't think it was feasible, but it was just showing that the relationship...
No, certainly. I mean when a country like Sweden decides that it might want to, the Russians go and show who's boss in the region.
Russia resumed the flights of the strategic bombers when the relationship with NATO countries and with the United States, specifically Great Britain, deteriorated to a large extent. And so we have seen NATO military maneuvers in the Baltic Sea at a distance of a few dozen kilometers from Kaliningrad, which is a Russian port, not a NATO port. And we have seen a resumed NATO activity in the Black Sea, uncomparable with what happened before. And so one of the Russian responses was to resume those strategic flights. And that's the result of the deterioration of the relationship with NATO.
And I want to bring that, and Tajan Ildem, you can fold your response into this. And let me just ask you, as we bring this back to Syria, how do they feel within the corridors of power at NATO that when it comes to Operation Peace Spring and the pause and trying to ensure that fighting doesn't resume and there's a solution, the solution comes from, most likely, President Erdogan meeting with President Putin. That the solution lies, at least in part, with Russia. Does it upset the NATO alliance?
Well, first of all, to have a quick reaction
Certainly.
to my Russian colleague, I remember in 2000.
Sorry, these microphones
Yeah.
need a bit of a twist, yeah.
In 2002, I was personally involved in the convening of a meeting to found NATO-Russia Council in Pratica di Mare in Italy. It was quite an important event, and we established a forum with all nations, including Russia, to have an equal say. And the two pillars of this engagement was political dialogue and practical cooperation. And what has happened that we suspended this practical cooperation? It is the watershed year of 2014 when Russian Federation illegally and illegitimately annexed Crimea. It was against the very principles of documents like Helsinki Final Act that the Soviet Union then was a party to. Therefore, we cannot consider things in vacuum. There is a historical background, and NATO countries didn't come up out of the blue to enlarge towards Russia.
But certainly, but because NATO was founded when there was Stalin, does it mean that they have to treat Russia like it's led by Stalin all the time?
No. But if we all agree that territorial integrity, to respect territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of other nations is something which governs the European security. And if there is one country challenging this very principle, and it becomes a continuous pattern of behavior to challenge rules-based international order, then others have to take certain measures. And that's why NATO leaders in 2014, at the level of heads of state and government, decided to strengthen its deterrence and defense. But while doing so, in 2016 Warsaw Summit meeting, they adopted a dual-track policy towards Russia. One component is strong deterrence and defense, and the other one is meaningful dialogue. So we didn't close the doors. We still have NATO-Russia Council meeting at ambassadorial level, and since 2016, we have convened 10 meetings, and they discuss a number of issues. First and foremost, the crisis in and around Ukraine, and allies in a united fashion expressed their unacceptance of illegal, illegitimate annexation of Crimea, and try to influence ways to implement the Minsk agreements. And also they use this forum as a means of transparency and risk reduction by exchange of briefings on upcoming exercises, military exercises, large-scale ones, so that there is no chance for any miscalculation for incidents to occur to escalate to a major crisis.
Does it bother you that they might be a part of the solution in Syria?
Well, I can tell you that Turkey is, as I said, a frontline country next to a volatile region. It has legitimate security concerns. And at a time when all parties having forces in that country, Syria, they coordinate to a certain extent their efforts. It is quite normal that Turkey engages with Russian Federation bilaterally. and other NATO allies also have a level of engagement with Russian Federation, and I don't think that it is a problem for NATO.
Jan Vincent Rostovsky.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to continue what the Secretary General said and also what your Minister of Defense said, which is that NATO is not just a mutual, a collective security organization. It's one that's based on the principle of defending the rule-based international order, particularly in Europe, in region. Mr. Pushkov's statement that Russia has no conflict with any NATO member, in a sense implies we will respect the international rules-based order as far as NATO members are concerned. But we don't have to respect it as far as non-NATO members, such as Ukraine and Georgia, are concerned. I think that Russia should think very seriously before it goes down that path, because that, of course, then becomes an additional impetus for those countries to desperately seek NATO membership. The fact is that NATO is committed to the international rules-based order. It cannot ignore the fact that Russia has violated it on a number of occasions, including, by the way, kidnapping a NATO intelligence officer in Estonia at a time when President Obama was in the country, which was, shall we say, interesting. But just a second. And therefore, in that context, it's not surprising that NATO continues to focus on what we can call euphemistically the Russian problem. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there haven't been problems going the other way as well. For instance, renouncing the INA treaty, I think is a very problematical thing. And we can talk about that as well. I think that would be useful. But nevertheless, there's no point in us closing our eyes to the reason that NATO is focused to a significant extent on what's called the Eastern flank, but which I was brought up to remember as the Central Front.
Alexei Pushkov, please.
You know, I will not go into details because otherwise it will carry us too far into history. But what is, I think, important? NATO is not just a European organization. NATO has been moving out of the area. And this concept of NATO moving out of the area has become almost official, if not official, in the last 10 years. NATO has conducted an operation in Afghanistan. It's not Europe. NATO countries conducted war against Libya with the results we know. It's a catastrophe in Libya. So when I hear about a rules-based order, my question to my Western colleagues is, why does NATO not react politically at, for instance, the occupation of an independent sovereign country, which Iraq was, by the United States and Britain? Although there was no threat from Iraq to the United States and Britain, there was no weapons of mass destruction, and all this nonsense about Saddam Hussein having ties with Al-Qaeda has been already rejected by the United States themselves. And as far as I remember, even President Obama was against the war in Iraq, but NATO was silent on this score. If there are rules-based things that everybody should observe, why those rules are being applied to some and not applied to others? I want also to remind you that the first break of international law in Europe happened in Yugoslavia. As you remember, Kosovo was divided, taken away from Serbia without Belgrade consent. I know there are a lot of sympathies towards Kosovo in this country, and for good reasons. But from the point of view of international law, it could not have been admitted. It was a unilateral declaration of independence, supported, as you know, until now by 100 countries, which prevents Kosovo from entering the United Nations, because a number of even member states of NATO are worried about this, like Spain and others. So my question is, why the rules are being applied in certain occasions and in other occasions the rules are not applied? Is it a situation when depicted by George Orwell in his famous Animal Farm, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than the others?
Okay, Ambassador Tajan Ilde. And I would ask you to consider the round of applause as well and factor that into your response. Why?
Well, first of all, we have to recall what had happened in the case of Kosovo. There has been a very long period of negotiations. International community was involved in the discussions. There was a contact group efforts. So all diplomatic efforts were consumed. But at the same time, there was an ongoing bloodshed, humanitarian suffering, which prompted NATO allies in response to the call from the international community, the United Nations, to initiate an operation. Whereas in the case of annexation of Crimea, it took only 30 days. So I don't think that there is any basis for comparisons of both.
Okay. There's something that I want to ask.
Just very briefly.
Sure, go ahead.
On Kosovo, I must say I'm rather surprised in Istanbul to hear an audience applauding a Russian diplomat, a Russian politician in the context of Kosovo. Particularly as Kosovo was not the first occasion where we had events of that kind. Much more bloody and much more shocking was what happened in Bosnia, and you have Bosnian as one of the languages here. And I think that Western Europe, and not only Western Europe, also many countries of Central Europe and my own country, felt a great deal of solidarity, particularly with Bosnia. So I can only repeat how surprised I am at that previous round of applause. Thank you.
Well, you also received a round of applause there, so...
Well, yeah, and I'm very
Democracy.
grateful.
So Luke Coffey, something that's interesting here is that, all animals are equals, but some animals are more equal than others. This idea that a rules-based order, it's claimed as a rules-based order, but generally accepted as a rules-based order as defined by Washington, the superpower. But then you have Donald Trump, who says, I don't care about all this nonsense. He's shown contempt for all the international institutions, even though the United States is still a part of NATO, undoubtedly, and spearheading it. He wants to go in a slightly different direction. Does that weaken these international institutions? Or does Trump's almost belligerence towards them make it more fair and more honest?
Well, with President Trump, you have to look beyond the tweets, okay? This is a president who, on the campaign trail, had a lot of things to say about NATO, not very good. Had a lot of things to say about Russia, which made many foreign policy practitioners in the US very nervous. But when you look at the policies coming out of this administration, you could argue that they've been some of the toughest policies on Russia and some of the best policies for European security since Ronald Reagan. This administration increased funding for the European Deterrence Initiative by 40% over the previous Obama administration. There are more US troops now in Europe and more going to Poland than the Obama administration. This administration has provided Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine and Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Georgia, something that the Obama administration didn't do in 8 years. President Trump did in 8 months. So I think we have to be a little more, we have to look at it in a bigger picture in terms of has this president been good or bad for institutions like NATO?
Right, so what you're saying is if he's a Russian agent, he's doing a terrible job of it.
I'm sorry?
If he's a Russian agent, he's doing a terrible job of it.
Well, go back to the NATO summit in Brussels most recently, where his first remark out of his mouth was very publicly in front of cameras criticizing Chancellor Merkel about Nord Stream 2. I don't really think that's a Russian talking point.
Right. I want to bring in Yavuz Selim Karan, bring in the Turkish diplomatic perspective here, using another example of a possible crack in the alliance, the S-400s. The NATO allies say, please don't go and buy these defense missiles from the Russians. They can hack our systems. It will undermine our collective security. Turkey goes ahead with it anyways and gets kicked out of the F-35 jet program. Is that an example that Turkey feels it can balance itself between the Russians and others, and NATO, and it doesn't quite have it doesn't have the fear of some sort of collective punishment that it might have had in the past by being a part of this multilateral institution?
My friend, first of all, we are all talking about the rules-based order. I would like to make this discussion a bit forward and to talk about the principle-based order. When we are talking about the rules, every country, each and every country can comment on itself and according to their interests, those rules. That is what happens in our region. You ask our colleague, Ambassador İldem, that how do you see the meeting between Erdogan and Putin as a Deputy Secretary General of NATO? We should first ask, what is Russia doing in Syria? What is United States is doing in Syria? What is France and Germany are doing? What are they doing there? We as Turkey have more than a 900-kilometer border with Syria, and everybody in international community are discussing why are Turkey holding this operation against this very existential threat and to this terrorist organization. If we talk about the principles rather than the rules, then things get more better than the things are today. So I see very unnecessary discussing about, not unnecessary, but as a detail, while we are talking about the articles, charters. Of course, we are believing in the legitimacy and international law, and we are contributing it. And coming to S-400 system, it is the same principle. That's why I am talking about the principle-based world order. Why did we take S-400 system from Russia? When we are giving answer to this question, then let's look at what did Turkey do before we took it from Russia. We first went to our allies in NATO and demand air missile system to protect ourselves, but they didn't provide us. So that's why, and we went to other allies within NATO, and they didn't give enough support to Turkey. So we as far as I remember, we had waited for 17 months in order to get answer from our US ally. So that's why. So we have to protect ourselves. So that's why we gained this S-400 system, and it will not show any shift against our natural direction. Of course, we believe in NATO. We are at the center of NATO alliance. It will continue to be so. However, we need to protect ourselves. So
right.
Russia gave this support to Turkey, and they provide us the most feasible system.
And you say principle-based order, and I guess part of the whole debate here is there are different parameters that each player in this uses for defining what's a principle-based system, right? And that's why we're having this debate. Alexei, you want to jump in, sir?
Yeah, two remarks. I want to ask the question what Russia is doing in Syria. Russia, unlike France or Great Britain or the United States, is absolutely legally in Syria. It's in Syria on the invitation of the Syrian government. If you can show another Syrian government, I will be interested to have a look. But for the time being, and I think for a long time to come, the government in Damascus is the only legal government represented in the United Nations. And so we are dealing with the government which is in place. And we have military agreements with this government, so we played a key role in defending the security in Syria and also in bringing down Daesh in Syria. That's my first remark. My second remark about the C-400. I think that there is one very simple issue. It's the issue of efficiency. And the C-400 were bought not only by Turkey, they were bought by China, they were bought by India in spite of the fact that the United States threatened India with sanctions. But India did not come along. They bought the C-400. And remember this last incident when Saudi Arabia oil plants were attacked by drones and by missiles?
Would they have been saved with the S-400s?
And they had the Patriots, and Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary, was asked why the Patriots did not defend Saudi Arabia in this situation. And he said, well, these missiles work with different success, as he said, which means from time to time. Well, the C-400 work every time, and that's, I think, a very important answer.
And I remember President Putin making that point and saying, well, you know, maybe we're open for business now. 5 minutes left here before I have to wrap up. So, the 5 people on the panel here, it gives us all about 1 minute to talk. And maybe let me just start from my immediate left with the ambassador. Big picture, should this NATO alliance be strengthened? Should NATO grow bigger? Or does it need to be restructured and maybe made smaller?
Well, on the 70th anniversary, I can definitely testify to a statement that it should be preserved, and especially when we have challenges in keeping multilateralism intact, it would be essential to keep NATO functioning well, responding to the security concerns of each and every ally. Definitely, NATO continues to attract attention of others to aspire to join NATO, and we are in the process of welcoming Republic of North Macedonia as the 30th ally in our midst. And 4th of December, as I alluded to earlier, would provide our heads of state and government in London to take stock of the achievements of NATO of the past as the most successful political and military alliance of the world, but at the same time to look to the future with the way it can respond to emerging security challenges. The minister was talking about disruptive technologies, the importance of innovation, and NATO is an organization to offer a lot in that sphere as well.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Jan Vincent Rostovsky, expand it or rethink it?
Well, we certainly need to maintain it. It's a key element of the security architecture. But the fundamental problem that NATO faces at the moment, the most important problem, is the problem of the reliability of the key member state of NATO, which is the United States. And under President Trump, that reliability is no longer there.
But Luke Coffey's saying you're just reading his tweets. You're not seeing the big picture.
I haven't been reading Trump's. No, I'm not reading his tweets. I notice what he did in the context of Syria, which is a clear issue. Leaving aside the question that we were talking about earlier, this is a clear, massive signal that the United States, under President Trump, are not as reliable as they have been for all these years. And I think even countries that may feel happy about this in the short term, like Turkey, may actually find that they regret this massively in the longer term. We shall have to see what happens in the United States, but this is the central key problem of NATO today. And I rather regret that we didn't talk about that a bit more. And I have to say I very fundamentally disagree with what Mr. Kofi said in that context, because he was abstracting from this question of reliability, which everybody is now clear is the major problem for our organization.
Okay, US reliability. Yavuz Selim Karan, from the Turkish diplomatic perspective, from the foreign ministry, expand and consolidate NATO or rethink?
My friend, we really believe in the philosophy of NATO, and we try to be at the center of all the NATO operations because we believe that NATO is stronger with Turkey and Turkey is stronger with NATO. So that is what I would like to underline, and I would like to celebrate the 70th anniversary of NATO. It is less than 2 months. Our heads of states will be convening in London to celebrate this 70th anniversary, and we hope that NATO will adapt itself to the post-Cold War conditions. We have very much new generation threats, including mass migration, including hybrid warfare, including cyber technologies, including Islamophobia, racism. So if NATO adapts itself to those conditions, then it will be stronger. Thank you very much.
Okay. Alexei Pushkov, are you okay with them expanding and strengthening?
Well, strengthening NATO is not exactly my issue. It's up to member countries to decide whether they want to strengthen or to weaken it. What I would like to say is that I'm deeply worried by the lack of dialogue between Russia and NATO. Our NATO colleague told you about the Russian NATO Council, and it was all true until a certain moment. But for more than 1 year, we don't have an ambassador in NATO. He was called back to Moscow, and our office was cut in two in Brussels. And the reason is that there is no dialogue, and there is no point of keeping an ambassador in a situation when there is no dialogue. I'm afraid that Mr. Stoltenberg, as General Secretary, when he says that NATO is talking to Russia from the position of strength but conducts a dialogue, is correct only in one respect, that NATO tries to talk to Russia from a position of strength, but there is no dialogue. And this is very dangerous, because the talk about dialogue covers the fact that there is no dialogue. And we are not discussing serious issues with NATO as an organization at all. I do completely agree with our Polish colleague that we have to discuss the withdrawal of the United States from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, because Russia has frozen in response its membership in the treaty, but we have not withdrawn from the treaty. We said the moment US is back, we are back. And I know this because I approved this in the upper chamber of the Russian parliament. But NATO is not there. We discussed this with the French, we discussed it with the Germans, but we don't discuss it with NATO. So NATO is conspicuously absent from the Russian-Western dialogue.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask for permission. We're 1 minute 30 over. I'm going to ask for permission from my colleagues if I can go another 3 or 4 minutes over, because it's not often that we actually have a Russian-NATO dialogue, which is the whole point of this all, talking to each other. Luke, before we get to you, let me just get a response from the ambassador. Is it NATO who's being sticky about this rather than the Russians?
Well, first of all, we have to recall what has happened for the demise of the INF Treaty. It is one of the fundamental pillar documents that governs European security. And unfortunately, with the deployment of Russian SSC-8 system.
What is SSC-8 system, by the way?
It is an intermediate range nuclear ballistic missile, and it was a clear violation of the INF Treaty. And that's why the United States, together with allies, and it's a united position, informed Russia with a notice of 60 days for it to return to compliance, full compliance, verified compliance. And at the end of this time, unfortunately, it was 2nd of August, we witnessed the demise of the INF Treaty. Therefore, it was not out of the blue that the United States, together with allies, decided to put this document to the bin.
Okay.
It was for certain reason.
Okay, well, you've heard both sides on this. Luke Coffey, as we wrap up, I'm 3 minutes over. Is NATO fit for purpose? Should it be consolidated, strengthened?
Yeah, well, firstly, before I address that question, we should not forget why there's this breakdown in communication. And that is because Russia invaded Ukraine and is now occupying Crimea. I mean, it was described by my Russian colleague here that it was a very complex situation, but it is Ukrainian territory, as recognized by the international community, that is now under Russian occupation. It's very simple. Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Russia is the aggressor with Ukraine. Ukraine did not invade Russia. And now, as a consequence, Ukraine misses out on billions of dollars in its GDP because of the loss of Crimea. And then minority groups like the Crimean Tatars are persecuted on a daily basis. No one says anything about this in the Muslim world other than Turkey, I have to say. And then we're all supposed to sit here and pretend like it's okay. We should talk. Yeah, we should talk, but we should understand why we're not talking right now before we decide to talk. On the point about consolidate or
And just to add to that, and is it then no surprise that Ukraine wants to join NATO? Because if it was a member of NATO, it could say, hey, Article 5, come to our defense.
Yeah, that's true. And the Russians have mastered, they worked out a perfect way to prevent countries from integrating into the Euro-Atlantic community. Right now, Moscow knows that all they have to do is invade and partially occupy a country, and that is the end of their Euro-Atlantic aspirations. That's what happened to Georgia in 2008 after the Bucharest, and that's what we're seeing now with Ukraine. But in terms of consolidating NATO, or should we expand NATO, I think we have to be careful with the words we use. Firstly, I hate the word expansion because it plays into the propaganda that NATO is some sort of empire. NATO enlarges. It enlarges because democratic countries decide through a democratic process that they want to join an alliance, and that alliance, through a democratic process, welcomes that democratic country in. It's not about expanding, it's about enlarging. And the second point I want to make about NATO in general is we need to get back to basics. Because another point my Russian colleague made is very true. From Moscow's point of view, they see NATO intervening in Libya. They see NATO intervening in Afghanistan. And they think, well, you say it's about collective defense, but look what you're doing in other places around the world. And I have some sympathy for that argument. NATO needs to get back to the basics of territorial defense. It doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but according to Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which describes where Article 5 applies, it must be in the North Atlantic region, north of the Tropic of Cancer, able to defend the territory of its members. So I think we need to brush off the founding document and let that guide us going into the future.
Okay, almost 7 minutes over, and I know that any longer, and the forum organizers will invoke Article 7, which is to make sure I never moderate again. But I want to get the final Russian reaction. Mr. Pushkov, you're slightly outnumbered, so in less than a minute, please.
Thank you. We're short of time. But I just want to stress that things are not that simple, that Russia invaded that, Russia invaded that. Take Georgia. In 1992, the Georgians induced in what was called by the local population, the Abkhaz and the Ossets, genocide. Go to Ossetia and go to Abkhazia, and they will tell you that they will never go back to Georgia. That's the same answer you will get in Kosovo, because the Kosovo said it was genocide perpetrated by the Serbs. And the Kosovo people turned to the United States and NATO for defense. It's exactly the same situation. The Abkhaz turned to us to defend them from Georgians. In 1992, 3,000 Abkhazians were killed there, and there are only 120,000. So 1 out of 4 Abkhazians were killed on the territory of Abkhazia by the Georgian army. So it looks like, Russia is doing, we just defended the right of these people to have a secure life and their own republics. They are not recognized, but look at them. They are not running away from Russia. They are staying with us because the alternative is much, much worse. So things are not as simple as you portray them.
Okay, well, we've had dialogue. We've had respectful, conflict, and we've had a free platform for everybody to share their views. And I am most grateful for the opportunity to chair this. I thank you all for listening, and I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen.